Finance Committee of Grand Rapids Public School Board for Monday, March 24. And our first item on our agenda is public comment. And so we have one public comment card, which is Mr. D. Jones. Mr. Jones, you have 3 minutes to make your public comment. Give me 1 second, I'm gonna get a timer up. And then, alrighty, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. How y'all doing? I'm D. Jones, passionate entrepreneur, pioneer, visionary, future billionaire. And I promise I'm going to give back to the school district once I get rich. I've already been giving back, and just not at the level that I like to be at, but I'm going to get there one day. Today I was just at the City Council speaking to the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability and Equity, because they have 4 pillars of things that they've been working on. They had like a night quest with Life Quest, city vibes with GBSU and the school district, and then esports because of D. Jones, which is now actually a pillar that the city actually focuses on to actually reduce violence, but also just have an alternative for kids just to stay off the streets and have something to do during the summer. So. And then they also have financial literacy, which is pretty cool because I love finances. I actually read a lot. When I read a lot, I read about business and finances because I love to study numbers. And so I'm just very excited to be able to partner with you guys on developing not just the esports activations and having a $32 billion company, Epic Games, who developed the Unreal Engine, that you can use blockchain technology to actually utilize cryptocurrencies in the games and digital finance and NTFs and all of these cool things that youth and people utilize at different ages and backgrounds and ethnicities, but to just be able to offer these opportunities to the students in the second worst city for economic development for African Americans, and ethically, equitably offer that opportunity to every single student that's 13 and up across the city, across the school district. And then we're working with Ken ISD and Ferris State University and other organizations to help build opportunity, as Ferris State University is going to be start offering varsity scholarships, and they'll be advising us through this entire summer in programming. I'm very excited to be able to have them being able to actually look at our students, because our students will get scholarships to be able to go to Ferris State University for esports, and that'll be a cool story for us to be able to, in all of these other colleges across the nation, and then the regional finals at the DeVos Place in November during Comic-Con, and being able to have an event that the school district can be a part of. I hope you guys are a part of this, because Comic-Con is the 5th largest event, and a lot of our revenue from Kent County comes from tourism, and people are actually bringing events here, hosting events, and it's the 5th largest event. So it's going to be pretty cool. I know it's going to be good for our community, and I'm just very thankful to be able to partner and to be able to pioneer and create initiatives that's going to definitely change our society and one day the world. I'm going to go speak to the United Nations and speak about the things that I'm developing. And thank you to Grant Action 2.0 for inviting me to the soccer stadium. I'm going to keep being on the DeVosses about our taxes. Thank you.
And next we have some finance action items, our purchasing agenda. Everybody have a chance to look it over? Are there any particular questions? I think I'd rather take it that way. Do you have any particular questions, or do you want to give us a little bit?
That's what I was going to say. It is not a very lengthy purchasing agenda, so if we want to go to questions, we can do that. I have some of my colleagues here. If there's some questions on some of their items, we'll call them forward.
Okay. Mr. Williams?
Yes. If we could, looking at B2 and 3 on, sorry, what is that? On other special funds, looking at B2 and 3 with the people-driven technology, could we just look a little further, particularly into 3, about how that cost breaks down, what that's going towards? I know some of these costs are built in. If we could just elaborate on that.
Okay, I'm going to ask Craig Gurry to come forward.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Yes, so to do some of the breakdown for B2 and 3, so although B2 is a little straightforward because of its applicability to Southeast Career Pathways, 3 is part of an initiative that we have used to upgrade what's generally considered as edge electronics within our school buildings. Those are infrastructure components that literally edge devices are connected to. So all the access points and televisions and all of those devices connect directly to this equipment. And all of our schools have some sort of complex of these equipment. And as we try to do a 5 to 7 year refresh rate on those, we have pretty historically utilized our federal E-rate funds to do so, and we're attempting to do here again this year. Not to get too much into the weeds there, but there's a 5-year window cycle on those funds, and this is the 5th year for this cycle, and it times out right with the buildings that we have some needs still at, and those are the ones listed here. And so just to give you a quick breakdown, all of the components that are among those are primarily hardware components themselves, so there are switches or routers that go in wiring closets, along with all of the interfaces and other accessories that kind of snap into those units. There is some licensing for them that is bundled with the switches, but those are the smallest portion of the total cost. They range from, if we look at smaller buildings on this list, like Blandford School, where we're less than $10,000 worth of equipment, to some of our larger buildings like Alger and Ford, where they're more in the $100,000 range. And really, if you think about edge equipment, it's all about the footprint of the building for the most part. How many data ports are there in the building? You got a 3-floor building that's a large building, like a middle school. We tend to have a lot more there. A high school, obviously, even larger. Blandford School is a very small physical structure, and so we just don't need as much electronics to service the components there.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
All righty. Is there a motion to approve the purchase, move the purchasing agenda to the full board?
Seconded.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign? Okay. And then we are going to donations.
Okay, our first donation again is from Sherry Lynn Noe and Friends. This one you'll see there was a large collection, and it has gone on since the fall through March to, in the last couple of weeks. It took a while to compile everything because it is a very large donation, so that's why it is coming now instead of earlier. So as you can see, she continues to be out there to gather up a large number of donations for our scholars.
Is there a motion to bring this donation to the full board?
So moved.
Seconded.
All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign? Wonderful. And then our last action item is a donation again.
Again, we were approached by a community member that had a piano that was no longer being used. So after checking and make sure it would be viable for us to use at C.I. Frost Middle High School, and they are going to pay the delivery costs to get it moved there as well. So it's a nice addition to our music program.
Is there approval for this donation to go to the full board?
So moved.
All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, same sign? All righty, then we're going to our reports, updates, and discussion. Ms. Chris.
So again, we've got our monthly financial statements. So I did go ahead and have staff update the budgets to Amendment 3, even though it was adopted at, I believe, at your March 3rd board meeting. So it wasn't in February, but it just brings things more in line. I don't have a whole lot of comments, but if you've got some questions, I could address those.
Not at this time. I'm good. Thanks, Rhonda.
Okay, wonderful. And then we will go into the time that you have set up for some training for us.
Okay, so one of the things that we've done the last few years is to start to do some, we call them 101s, but there's a lot of different topics that we can go to. So some of this is addressing, I'm going to go through a school finance 101. Some of it you've seen little snippets, but we always have just little snippets of time to talk about school finance. So I'm just going to start to go in through it. I'm going to ask if we can kind of let me go through the presentation, because you might have a question and I might just answer it in a couple slides behind it. So hopefully at this point there will be time at the end that we can ask questions. So this is kind of the review, and now I think you may have heard this a couple times. As GRPS, we do do our accounting using fund accounting. Our general fund is our basic overall primary fund. It's the operating funds for the districts. It does include athletics and grants, so it's got our state and local and federal grants as well as the general operating funds. Special revenue funds are funds for specific designated purposes, and there's usually legal, regulatory, or administrative action to designate it. There has to be a revenue stream for it to stay as a special revenue fund. So it's not just like athletics used to be years ago, a special revenue fund, but the primary source, athletic fees only cover a small portion of the athletics cost. So that's where it moved back into general fund. For us, it does include our food service fund, our Grand Rapids Area Summer Program, or GRASP, Houseman Field, our student activity funds. Those are like the class clubs or building principals funds at schools. And then we've got our public purpose trust funds as well, so that we've got a number of trust funds that have been established many years ago, for the most part, to do scholarships or other type of specific purposes. Debt service funds, this is when we issue debt. So we do have funds that we levy property taxes on to be able to make the principal and interest payments for those. Capital projects funds, so like when we issued our bonds a year ago, seems like a lot longer ago, a year ago, that went into a capital projects fund, all the proceeds from that. So that's now, as we're doing those capital projects, we're drawing down on those funds. So it can be used for things like the buildings, the major renovations, and certain equipment. Fiduciary funds, those are ones that we hold in capacity as a fiduciary, and we only have 2 trust funds that didn't qualify to move into the special revenue funds. So they're sitting still in fiduciaries. It's pretty minor for us at this point. General fund revenue sources, you see we kind of categorized it between local, state, and federal. The millages, just to highlight that does include our Act 18 countywide special ed millage and our enhancement millage. State aid categorical, in addition to our membership, is a large amount, and there are other state grants. And then we only listed a few of our federal grants there, but there are a number of other smaller grants as well. So this is where we are using our Amendment 1 numbers. You'll see property taxes and other local sources and the percentages there. Between property taxes and state unrestricted, that's our biggest part of our foundation allowance. And if you'll remember there, foundation allowance is the per pupil amount that you often hear referred to. This year it is 9,608, and our blended student count is approximately 610. It's still going through the audit process, so that will likely get adjusted a little bit as we go through. So big picture, our foundation allowance should be about 130.7 million. But that's broken out in those 2 categories between the local property taxes and state aid. And you'll see a little bit of reconciling differences between actual, do some rounding and all of that. But, oops, went too far. There we go. Just want to start to build in some historical perspective for you. So if you just looked at the last couple years, excluding 24, 25, you'll see we've had some pretty significant foundation allowance increases. And that's due to the COVID-19 funding that we received primarily through the federal government that flowed through to the state. If you start to go back, you'll see more recent foundation allowance increases are much, much smaller. As we come out of the COVID funding, both at our local and at our state level, the expectation is that foundation allowance increases will come back into that $100 to $200 range as we move forward. And having been around as long as we have, there were years where we actually saw decreases in foundation allowance increase. And as people know me, sometimes I'll go a little too far down history lane, but there was one year we got the foundation allowance cut in June after school had ended. So that's one of the pieces of information that when I'm conservative, I carry that story back in my head of what happens if they come again after the school year's ended and give us a foundation allowance decrease. Some of our major grants, we just listed them out, and where they're coming through, if there's a formula, if there is a, I see a kind of a typo there on GSRP, that is a state grant that's formula, and what the purpose is for it, as well as where we are budgeted for this current fiscal year. COVID grants ended as of September 30th, so these are some holdout remaining balances that are in our 24-25 budget. We did fully expend all of our COVID funding. That GEAR 2024 grant was one that the private schools, back when we had our GEAR, and I actually don't remember what the GEER stands for, but it passed through the state government. There was an allocation to private schools. They did not fully expend all of their money. So when the state was allocating out their funding in July, they wanted to spend everything. So they went back to the local school districts and gave an additional allocation. So we used it to cover some of our summer school costs from last year. I wanted to show the extent of our COVID funding. We had over $128 million over the course of those about 4 to 5 years. You see there were 17 different grants that we worked through. And when I talk about the COVID cliff, or the ESSER cliff, this is what it is. So all those years, we were adding things and trying to be intentional because we knew it was going to come to an end. We didn't use it to add a lot of staff, and where we did add staff, we were intentional to think of a sustainable funding source afterwards, and primarily tried to focus on one-time uses. With ESSER funding, we were allowed to do supplanting, which is highly unusual, and I've never seen it before with federal funding. And what we did with that, back when we started with this is most of the COVID funding, we were getting the money, but they hadn't decided what the requirements and the regulations were gonna be at the time we got the money. So there was a lot of, okay, we developed a plan and this is what we're gonna spend our COVID funding on. And then weeks, months later, they would come back and say, oh no, you can't use it for that. So there was a lot of shifting around to make sure that as we were spending our COVID funding, it was for allowable uses. But at the time, we may have already made progress down thinking we could use it. One of the initial things we were gonna use it to help support our athletic program as well. Well, that was one. Months later, they came through and said, no, you can't use it for athletics. So since ESSER 3 especially allowed for supplanting, we started moving general operating costs over to the ESSER 3 grant to be able to use general fund dollars to do some of those things that were in our original ESSER 2 and 3 plan. So I know that gets a little confusing and it was a lot of moving parts, but that's where it was to stay within guidelines, and we always did that, but it was just kind of like, okay, well, we have this plan. We were progressing down for the plan and they said, oh no, you can't use it for that. Well, sometimes the money had already been spent, so then it was like, okay, how can we still make everything work? So that's kind of the story behind ESSER. But again, it was trying to make sure that we didn't build something that wouldn't be sustainable. That operating cost is a bit of a problem, that where we did the supplanting, and that's where you'll see it as we go back through and look at the impact on fund balance. It's a lot of those supplanting costs that we put over had to come back to general operating. So moving to expenditures, again, here we are with Amendment 1 expenses. It's $276.2 million if you add up all the buckets. And you'll see again, salaries and benefits, we're a service organization, so salaries and benefits are the largest portion of our budget. Purchase services, that is a large number. A lot of that is software, substitutes and contracted type services as well. And then you see even supplies and utilities in there. So some of the other numbers don't, even though they are large numbers in comparison to the rest of their budget, they're really not that large. I can say it that way. Benefits. Let's talk about benefits for a few minutes. Our biggest insurance is insurance and retirement, our biggest components. We also do have to pay employer social security and workers' comp costs. And then we've got a few miscellaneous other type benefits. There are a few people that may have health insurance through a spouse and therefore take a cash in lieu of benefits that way, or we do offer tuition reimbursements for our employee groups as well. Health insurance. This is one of our largest, and this is a little bit, I talked about it when we went through our budget amendment. I want to just kind of resurface that one because it is a complicated subject. So back in 2011, there was Public Act 152 that went into effect. And it either said a school district can either pay the hard cap amount determined by the state, or 80% of the cost is borne by the employer and 20% is covered by the employee. So this year in 2025, it's one that follows a calendar year process, so it resets every January. A single person coverage that is $7,718. A two-person is $16,141, and a family is $21,049. So you can see those are still significant amounts when you start to multiply by our employees, and as we go forward. Just a couple comments on PA 152. So back when it came into effect, the district was covering almost all of our employee benefit health insurance costs by ourselves. We were getting significant health insurance increases every year in double digits. So it was a relief to the district budget to have some cost share. Plan structure and design awareness became a lot more prevalent, both on the district side and for employees. And employees actually became more aware of the cost and probably became better consumers about health insurance plans instead of just taking a really expensive plan, but that's maybe not what actually was the best coverage for their family. Annual adjustments since it went into effect were the 0.2% to 4.1%. The 0.2% was the one that was actually in effect for 25. Most of the years the average is about 2.7. So there were a couple years there in the 3%, a little higher, sometimes in the 2%, but usually around that 3% plus or minus. And the 2026 adjustment, we haven't seen it. We usually get it in the first week or so of April. It's anticipated to be a 2.9 or a 3% increase again, so kind of returning to a more normal increase as far as hard cap goes. One of our challenges, I'm going to stay with health insurance for a second. When we did talk about health insurance in a budget amendment, I did bring up House Bill 6058. That was the one that was passed by the legislature in lame duck, but never transmitted to the governor for signature. It's still in limbo. If you picked up on it in the news, the Senate has sued the House to send it to the governor. They've gotten a ruling that said, yes, that should have happened, but they weren't going to make the House send it. And the Speaker is still saying he's not planning on sending it to the governor. Both sides have appealed it for their various reasons, so we're kind of in limbo about what's going to happen with this bill, but it did have a 7% increase to the hard cap as of January 1st, 2025. So that will be a significant increase to our budget. As we were doing Amendment 1 before more of this politics came into play. We did include an estimate in there for it, so before we wrap up Amendment 2, we will be checking it to see where this House Bill 6058 is. If it's still in limbo and doesn't look like it's going to happen or come to conclusion before June 30th, we'll do an amendment and we'll include an adjustment in our second budget amendment. But still in limbo of what that looks like. The other thing it did have in there is that where the 80% cost by the employer was a it was a ceiling, it now becomes the floor. So right now, we are paying hard cap, we're paying about 82 to 84%, so we'd still be above it. But depending on plan design and costs and all of that stuff, it may be one of those where we would have to meet both requirements with this plant if 6058 comes to fruition. The other problematic piece that's in that House Bill 6058 is their annual increase is tied to an index that doesn't exist. So as they were doing it, they thought, oh, well, it should be, and I don't remember the exact terminology, but it Department of Insurance and Financial Services gets rate increases from different health insurance companies. We'll tie it to that, and they just picked something. But that's not an index or information that the department collects. So that's problematic in that, okay, are you gonna now make them start collecting that information so you can get an index? Or are you gonna go to their next best thing, which really doesn't, it's apples and oranges. But that increase would have it be about a 10 or 11% increase on top of the 7% increase. So it's just, all in all, it's problematic. So having it be in limbo is probably okay for now. There's some things that probably do need to happen, so that will be interesting to see if the legislature takes it up in a new form at some point, but I'm not a politician and I get frustrated by it, so it's just kind of like, we'll see what they decide to do in Lansing and adjust what we do here in Grand Rapids based on what we hear, but it's a lot of unknown at this point, but it can be big dollars to our budget. Oops, I went backwards instead of forwards. Another complicated to our budget, and I mentioned it a little bit, but this, I promise you I won't talk about every line on here because it is a lot of information. But just on the right-hand side, those are MIPSers, or retirement system contribution rates that we're required to make. The state determines them. We don't have any say in what those rates are. An employee, when you come in, you select which plan you're going to be a part of, and you cannot change it. It stays that way forevermore. The part of it, some of the plans are closed, like the basic and MIP plans are for longer-term employees. That those plans were available when we started. Pension Plus was kind of a mid-range one that was available for a number of years, and I believe that one is closed now. So I think new employees can either choose the Pension Plus 2 plans or the defined contribution plans. In the middle there is that health normal cost rate. So this is another topic that we talked a little bit during the amendment. It relates to the healthcare fund out of the pension plan that last year we learned was overfunded. It's been, districts and employees in the state have all been paying into it since 2012, I believe. And it's now got enough, it's essentially overfunded. That's where for 24-25, the state did pass a law that for this year we are reimbursing employees for the 3% contribution that they're still required to make this year. As of October 1st, 2025, employees will stop making that contribution. However, even though the plan is overfunded, they are increasing the amount that the districts need to pay into that fund. So you'll see right now in fiscal year '25, we're paying 1.25%. That's going up to 3.83% for next year. On the left-hand side there in the middle, you'll see a 147G, $90 million. That's intended to offset 1.5% of the 2.5 or 2.58% increase. So 147G is where we're getting the money this year to reimburse employees. Next year, after October 1st, we won't have to reimburse employees anymore. That money should be coming to the district, and that's 90 million statewide, not 90 million for the district. Will get allocated out to the district based on employee salaries, presumably, to help reimburse that cost. So again, it's extremely complicated, and I know I'm talking fast, but just kind of wanted to get you into that. It's overwhelming to me, and I deal with it. It's all the different rates, all the different parts and the pieces to it, things getting changed back and forth, and it's another frustrating thing of when a fund is overfunded, why do we still have to put money into it? But going back to the left-hand side, excuse me, this year we did get a 147A4 allocation of $598 million. That is being eliminated for next year. The 147C, this is we get it in revenue, our allocation, but then we turn around within 2 days and pay it right back into the retirement system. So it's an in and out, but that rate is going back up for next year as well. So just kind of down at the bottom, you'll see the 147A, statewide, they're estimating it was about $400 per student. The MIPSers, under the 147G, we'll get about, estimated probably about $200 per student. Oops, no, that's a gain of 50 to 60. The MIPSers rate on the right-hand side, where you'll see a lot of those rates are going down, that's a gain of about 250. The 147G is probably a gain of about $50 to $60 per student. So if you net those together, we get about a net loss on MIPSers rates of about $150 to $200 per student. The 392 foundation allowance increase is the amount that the governor put out in her proposal. So if you see already, I'm like, oh, if you go back to the historic, 392 doesn't sound too bad. But then when you get the impact of the MIPSers rates, again, state controls them, we have no control over that, we're down to $192 of an increase. So that will be hard to pay all of our increasing costs with a foundation allowance increase of less than $200. So, a lot of information. Revenue versus expense. So this is again kind of a history going back to look. So the years where it's in orange below the zero, our expenses exceeded our revenue. And you'll see essentially the years where we added to and our revenue was greater than our expenses were during those COVID funding years where we were doing supplanting on our expense side and had the revenue coming in on the federal thing, from the federal government. And that on Amendment 1, we are at about a almost $4 million use of fund balance for this year. This is a look at our fund balance. The board policy is up there on the right-hand side, so you'll see again where we've been historically. There were just before COVID, and as COVID hit, we dropped down to about 7.3. Build it back up substantially using that supplanting to build up our fund balance. That 24-25 is our Amendment 1 use of fund balance that brings it down. Since we only went out one digits, it is actually like at 14.95, or it's just below 15%, but with rounding on the here it shows at 15%. So, as we're so dependent on the state, I wanted to just take a minute and talk about the state's budget process and what that looks like. So at the top, in that red box at the top, typically in January, there's a first revenue estimating conference that the state has. Typically, the governor, and some of this I'm gonna say typically because this is not a typical year. The governor does her state of the state towards the end of January. Her budget recommendation comes out in early February. This year, the state of the state and the budget recommendation were flipped as far as order goes. And then typically the House and Senate subcommittees will start to develop their budget proposals. What does that look like? In the last several years, they wait until down in that purple box, you'll see the second revenue estimating conference happens in May, usually around mid-May. So they wanted to wait to come out in public with their full-blown proposals until they see how much money is actually there in May. So you'll start to hear rumblings of what, oh, we like this, we don't like that. This is a priority for the House or the Senate, and start their budget deals, maybe do some hearings and all of that, but the last several years, it's run more into May, and they do a lot of compacted, what does it look like after the revenue estimating conference. The House and the Senate will, and leadership in the governor's office, I'll meet, sell up their budget targets and develop a budget proposal. They come up with a conference committee budget, usually at that point, that they will all agree to. At that point, there's an up and down vote. There's no changes allowed. And then once they pass it, it will go to the governor for signature, and she can line item veto certain items. Some years that's been more than others. And then you come around, they've set a goal of having a budget by June 30th. It's nice, but again, we have to adopt a budget by June 30th. They typically are into late June, so that's usually, we're still adopting a budget based on a lot of estimates and assumptions based on the best information we're getting out of Lansing. So we can have a budget adopted. They don't always get it adopted by June. Their state fiscal year starts October 1st, so they need to have something in place technically by September 30th. Given the challenges and all of that going on Lansing, we're kind of hearing that we may or may not have something by June 30th. It may be into August or September before we really know what state aid looks like for next year. Once they do their reconciliation of how they closed out 24-25, there may be funding still available, and they may put a supplemental budget through at that point. So it's kind of like we're really early in the process, and there's a lot of rumblings going on, but there's a lot of differences in Lansing that they'll need to work through as well. So I'm trying to not go too high or too low on where we are. So just highlights on some of the governor's budget proposals. So this is where she did have a foundation allowance increase of 4.1% that would get us to $10,000 per pupil. She did have 4.1% increases on Section 31A for at-risk, Section 41 English language learner, and special ed funding as well. They did continue $125 million ongoing funding for the Section 31A, the mental health money. That was one where last June they had dropped it to almost nothing, came back in a supplemental and added funding back in there. Section 16 best practices, or SMART, is a new line item in there. There are not a lot of details at this point of what it might look like. It does look like we would be eligible for it on one of the, I think it's House Fiscal puts out by school district potential amounts. But again, without knowing what strings it comes attached to, and it may not be a priority to the House and or Senate, so it may not end up in the final budget anyway. So and there aren't a lot of details of what that actually looks like. And when I say this isn't a normal year, the House a couple, 2-3 weeks ago, passed a House continuation budget for school aid. It seemed to be a surprise. I don't think the Republicans told the Democrats that they were going to do this before they brought it forward. And their House budget at this point only contains 4 items. It has a foundation allowance that would get us to $10,025. It has the Section 31AA mental health back up to about $350 million. As special ed categoricals and the MIPSers categoricals, both of which are more required based on statute. So it's $5 billion less than the current budget, and it's $2 billion in federal funding has not been included, including like our food service money and all of those other categories, the Section 31A, the Section 41, all of those critical funding sources to us have not been included. So what we've heard is this is their version of saying, if they can't get a budget deal by September 30th, we could still continue to operate. I'm thinking that's challenging, but it also gives me a little bit of pause to say, if in March, they're already thinking they're not gonna have a budget deal by September 30th, they're not very close together right now. They've got a lot of work to do in Lansing on what this looks like. So that's where I said, I'm trying not to go too high or too low and panic, that leaves a lot of things out. So I think there will be a lot of dealing going on in Lansing. One of those chips they may throw in is that House Bill 6058. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of moving parts. So that's the last item that I've had. So I've been talking a lot, and I know you've got a lot of questions. But I also know you've got a meeting coming up. So if you want to,
You look like you're ready.
I was gonna say.
I was gonna go to you, but he was
No,
going
no,
like
no,
this.
no, no,
So go
No,
ahead.
please,
Okay.
This is super helpful. Thank you so much. You answered actually a lot of my questions, so thank you for prompting us to wait until the end. My one question is around contingency planning, so I can understand process. We can still adopt a budget without knowing all the things.
Right. So what we'll do and what we'll bring to you in June will be a budget based on the best information that we have at the time, especially on that revenue side, because we don't know. It's not in our control for a large portion of it. So we'll let you know, these are the assumptions that we used. If it's significantly different, we can bring a budget amendment at any time. In a history, again, I've brought a budget amendment in July before. So depending on what happens and what goes forward, we can amend at any time.
No, thank you. Again, very helpful, and anticipated a lot of my questions. I'm still always trying to wrap my head around MIPSers, and I think everybody is. My understanding is we as a district are acting as basically a pass-through for a portion of this money going back to.
The 147C
Yes.
we are.
And that's gonna, okay, thank you.
Oops.
And what was that date? This October or next year, October? That will,
For the 147G,
yeah,
October 1st, 2025, employees won't have to pay the 3% anymore.
okay,
Districts will still have to pay into the fund, and that's that kind of in the middle there, that health normal cost rate.
okay. But at that point, we're not gonna act as a pass-through getting money to, because the
We still
teacher.
will have the 147C.
Okay.
So that's where there's like 6 or 8 different revenue categories for MIPSers as well as all of these expense side.
Okay,
So on 147C, I'll budget for revenue and I'll budget the same amount for expense.
okay, okay, thank you. And then with the capital projects fund, is that always, like, is there ever a point where that runs to zero, or are we always kind of maintaining it and keeping that funded for things as they come up?
Right now, our bond funded,
Yeah.
we will spend down to zero.
Yeah.
Will be over the course of years. So The voters approved a 305 million. So a year ago, give or take, we've issued the first $105 million worth of funds. So we've started the projects. Our original plan was that we would be essentially spent with that first tranche, is what they call it, first series, by next, like summer of 2026. So then we were looking to issue the next series in the summer of 26, and the last series of, I believe it was summer of 29. We're a little behind on spending, so that summer of 26, we may push out a little bit. The other thing, we'll be working with our financial advisor on the timing of it as well, about when the markets, because we'll want to time the markets. When we did the first series, they were watching the markets, and we went out a day or two early, and it probably saved several $100,000.
Yep.
So it's
Good.
always interesting to watch that part that it's like I'm a bystander on the outside and rely on that financial advisor, but
Yeah. And I can't remember which slide it is. Maybe it's revenue versus expense difference. That just looks so as we're looking at 24, 25, that just looks so much larger of a, in the yellow or in the orange there than previous years where we've been at a negative balance.
so that's part of coming off from COVID.
Okay.
And just, we were supplanting millions of dollars with salary costs for certain departments that were allowable under there. We also added several new, like, software programs that we were bringing on. So it's just kind of like, how as we wean ourselves off from COVID, what does that look like? What is going to stay? And there were software programs. We said, well, it was nice, but ongoing, that's not where we're going to go, and we don't have funding for it anymore. So this has kind of been our transition year to find out where we're really going to be at. As we're starting to go through budgeting for 25, 26, we are looking closely, line by line, about what is getting spent in general fund, how we can best utilize our grant funding to still make sure we maintain services, but use grant funding rather than our base funding on that as well. So yes, we are in a challenging position right now.
I always look for trend lines, and I'm just wondering, like, is that a trend line we're seeing, or is that sort of an anomaly coming off of COVID, and we're probably going to go closer to like 2018 to 19, or
I
14
would
to 15.
like, as your
hard to say,
conservative, as your conservative CFO, I would like to see a 21, 22, or 2016, where we're just a little bit better on revenue than expenditures. Realistically, we need to get back there sooner rather than later, because if we reduce our fund balance as quickly as we are this year, we're going to be in a deficit, and that's not legal. So we do have work to do to make sure that we stay above it. We do want to stay, the state typically has set their line at 5%, but they're also looking at trends. So if we really stay at a 15% as we close out the year, that could signal them at least inquiries about why such a steep drop in 1 year. And if you look at it, that steep a drop 1 year, 2 year, that's the trend line that they're looking at as well. So definitely want to do what we can to mitigate that and at least start to level off.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep.
I just wanted to ask a question with regards to insurance. So I know that there's some things that are out of our control. I'm wondering too, if you could just clarify, part of that will be negotiated with union contracts too? As far as the premium rates, so if they, or providers?
That's what I was gonna say. We will negotiate with our unions about which employee plans are available and what those costs will be and what they will look like and what needs to be for their employees. Currently, we do work with 2 health insurance providers. We work with West Michigan Health Insurance Pool and with Mesa for the MEA group. So
I had one more. In the general fund, you listed athletics. Do arts and music fall under the general fund as well, or
Yes.
do? Okay, cool. Thank you.
Any other questions? All righty, well, that is all. Thank you so much, Ms. Cribbs, and we don't have any policy. So this meeting is adjourned and.